Here is somebody who seemed to be so good, have incredible answers, powerful voice, and yet the whole thing was basically a scam. My husband seems to be a malignant narcissist. We're no longer together, and pretends pretty convincingly to be a religious, righteous person in front of other people, but it's basically a sham. You can have individuals who really try and they follow rules, but probably is not for quite the same reasons that you would hope for. Welcome to Fan Mail, a space where I answer your real questions about toxic relationships, narcissistic abuse, and the long road to healing. I always deeply appreciate it when you send me in your questions, when you give me these really wonderful situations and dilemmas for me to tackle for Fan Mail. So thank you so much for this listener who wrote me an email, and here's her question. Hello, Dr. Kerry. Do you think that there are some narcissists and psychopaths who work against their inclinations to deceive, exploit, and control others in order to live a relatively moral life? My husband seems to be a malignant narcissist. We're no longer together, and pretends pretty convincingly to be a religious, righteous person in front of other people, but it's basically a sham. I'm wondering if that's true of virtually all personality disordered people who claim to be religious, or if there are any that do earnestly try to live accordingly to moral standards of some kind, such as biblical principles. Thank you so much for taking the question. Thank you so much for sending in the question. I really deeply appreciate this. This is a complex issue that hits across several big topics. One is, can conscience develop in somebody who lacks one, or are there levels of conscience among disordered individuals? That's sort of one big question. The second question is, what actually does spiritual or moral development look like? And could someone seemingly follow or seemingly have moral code or like a standard or rules that they follow by, but not be very governed by their conscience? So to answer that question, I want to first start out with talking about moral development. Kohlberg suggested that there are 6 different stages to moral development. And to break them down into roughly big categories, let's talk about pre-conventional morality, conventional morality, and post-conventional morality. So stages 1 or 2, which is pre-conventional morality, is the focus is trying to avoid punishment or to gain some type of reward. So somebody who's acting from this level of development, moral development, would seem to act moral, but it's really in order to avoid being punished in some big way, like maybe going to prison, or if it's religion, maybe not going to hell. Or maybe they're also operating from some angle of not wanting to appear bad, not wanting to damage their reputation. So they only follow the rules in order to avoid some kind of fallout or consequence that they seem as undesirable. The stages, big stages of 3 and 4, which fits the conventional morality, those individuals, their focus is on approval, maintaining order, and upholding law. So they often will appear dutiful, law-abiding, and religious because it gains them admiration and belonging. So this type of code of ethics you might see, for example, in the mafia or gangs when there's enforced loyalty within the group. They look principled. They're following the code, but it's only conditional because it applies to the insiders, not to outsiders. And then there's the post-conventional morality, which is the stages 5 and 6. This is a focus on ethical principles, on justice and human rights. This is a stage that requires empathy and conscience and the ability to take another person's perspective. This psychopaths and narcissists would not fall into this category because their core deficits of low empathy or no empathy and their difficulty with self-reflection or self-focus would make this type of reasoning extremely difficult. So back to the questioner's bigger question is, does all religious people who have some type of personality disorder, is it just really for looks, or is there could something more sincere be happening below it? I think it's too easy to say it's this or that, in a yes or no. I think this is not a black and white question. I think it's on a continuum. I think there are some individuals with personality disorder who have a modicum of conscience and maybe low levels of empathy, and they have enough desire, maybe because of fear of consequences or belief in a something higher than themselves, that they would adhere to principles. But it's more for self-serving reasons than it is for altruistic ones. It's maybe not for the universal ethics of I want to be a good person, but more of it's the right thing to do and I don't want to be punished. But I also think that there are people who are doing it just for looks, that they see this as gaining them something, that they like the access that it gives them. They also like the moral superiority, which is also another form of arrogance and entitlement. So actually that's a form of narcissism. They enjoy that, the look of it. And they also really like the cultural acceptance and the power that it would give them. So then they adhere to it for the appearance of it. I'm thinking, for example, there was I don't know how many of you guys may know of him, but Ravi Zacharias was a huge kind of, not so much an evangelist, but he was definitely sort of a online presence who talked about sort of the gospel truths. And then when he passed away, it was found out that he had this terrible racket, this horrible abuse ring that was going on around him and at his beckoning, So yeah, here is somebody who seemed to be so good, have incredible answers, a powerful voice for religion, and yet the whole thing was basically a scam. The person didn't have that kind of ethics personally at all. So it can be on a range. You can have individuals who really try and they follow rules, but probably is not for quite the same reasons that you would hope for. It's not really for looking for the goodness of all, but more of out of their self-motivation and for themselves. But then there are other people who actually are doing it simply for control and power and because it gives them the kind of access they're looking for. So thank you so much for this really complex question. I appreciate the opportunity to sort of talk about this. And if you have a question for fan mail, please use the link that I've included in the description below to submit it. But you can also email it to me at hello@breakingfreenarcissisticabuse.com and put in the subject line fan mail.